Hi, Alex.
Hi, Sarah. How you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Fine.
To get us started here, I'll introduce myself first. I'm Sarah Posner. I'm Associate Editor of Religion Dispatches and also a Senior Correspondent for the American Prospect. And today I am here with Alexander Zaitchik, who is the author of a forthcoming book about Glenn Beck called Common Nonsense. And we're going to talk about Glenn Beck and religion. Alex, why don't you do a little introduction of yourself, too?
Sure. I am a freelance journalist and a contributing writer at AlterNet.org. And in a couple of weeks, this book Sarah just mentioned will be coming out. And that's about it.
Well, I was lucky enough to get an advanced copy of the book and can highly recommend it for anyone who wants to know more than they already know about Glenn Beck, perhaps from some of the stuff that Alex has written on Salon. The book is really excellent reporting and also insights into what makes Glenn Beck tick. But today we're going to talk about Glenn Beck and specifically Glenn Beck and religion. And I thought I'd start us off with the recent news that Beck is going to be the commencement speaker at Jerry Falwell's Liberty University. And, that was sort of interesting to a lot of people because I think there's this common perception that evangelicals don't like Mormons. And certainly in my reporting, I talked to evangelicals who don't like and don't trust Mormons. But Liberty really wrote that off and said, Glenn Beck is a good guy and, we don't care that he's a Mormon. Do you have any thoughts on that in terms of how Beck is perceived in the evangelical world and how his Mormonism plays or doesn't play there?
Right. Well, the same sort of thing happened a couple of years ago when Romney spoke at the Regent commencement ceremony. You had a lot of criticism coming from evangelicals and defense from the administration. It's kind of a perfect fit when you think about it. Liberty University is something like the Fox News of higher education in America, sort of become a political organization masquerading as something else. And he also is in line, certainly, with previous commencement speakers they've had, thinking of such luminaries as Chuck Norris and I think last year's was Ben Stein. So he's in line with the history. As for the historical antagonism between Mormons and evangelicals, it's this sort of ongoing rapprochement that I think now is probably into its fifth decade. Since the 70s, when you started to see the first sort of détente between the two sides. Last stats I saw on it, about 50% of evangelicals still don't consider Mormons Christians. They consider them to be a cult, and a rather bizarre one at that. So it's this sort of halting, process of coming to terms with each other, even though it seems like they're natural allies. Their interests on the issues line up pretty perfectly, and also even the doctrinal differences that caused the rift in the first place have been narrowing pretty considerably over the last 50 years. The new sort of Mormon neo-orthodoxy that's sort of come of age after World War II is a lot closer doctrinally and culturally to sort of mainstream evangelicals than Mormonism used to be.
Well, let's talk about the politics of this a little bit, because Beck and Jerry Falwell share, shall we say, a sort of intellectual or political godfather in Cleon Skousen. Back in the 70s and 80s when Fallwell was building the moral majority, and of course Fallwell was the founder of Liberty University, he worked closely with Skousen, who Beck has described publicly, very publicly, as his intellectual godfather. He's promoted Skousen's book, The 5,000-Year Leap, on his television show, and is largely responsible for its increased sales more recently. Can you talk a little bit about Skousen, his influence on Beck, and why he had an alliance with Fallwell?
Right. Well, Skousen, it's hard to know where to really begin with him. He's one of the more important Mormons of the last century. He basically brought mainstream Mormonism into line with hard right politics and gave birth to Mormonism that we know today that created the sort of political culture in Utah that we see now. It's overtly political, deeply involved in issues like Proposition 8 and political crusades, which used to be anathema to Mormons. They wanted nothing to do with getting
as it did evangelicals as well.
Sure. So Skousen was the guy who sort of brought the Birch Society into the heart of the Tabernacle, in essence. And part of his work in the 19th...
So you're talking about the John Birch Society. So he was very involved in anti-communist agitation in Utah in, say, the 1950s, early 60s?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, he was a national figure in that world of extreme anti-communist sort of agitation. He toured and lectured widely and wrote a couple books that sold in the millions. He used to be a household name, not so much anymore, although that's done quite a bit to change that. But in the 1970s, he sort of changed his focus from anti-communism and anti-New World Orderism towards what he called constitutionalism, which is a bit of a misnomer because it was actually Christian constitutionalism, the idea that he needed to restore the U.S. Constitution to where he thought it should be, much as Mormons seek to restore the gospel of Jesus Christ to where they think it should be. It sort of mirrored that Mormon project, although he didn't advertise it as such. But it was well known to be a Mormon project. And Fallwell at the time was, of course, the central figure in bringing together what has become the religious right. Together with Reverend Moon, he was bringing disparate figures together. Skousen was one of those. And
you're talking about Sun Myung Moon, the owner of, or the one-time owner of the Washington Times, and the messianic figure at the top of the Unification Church.
Yeah. So Fallwell and Skousen sort of formed this evangelical Mormon nexus. They were involved together in the Council for National Policy, which at the time, in the early 80s, was described as a sort of, Council on Foreign Relations of the right, which gave rather extremely conservative policy recommendations to the first Reagan administration, and also served to sort of create the agenda for...
And it still is. I mean, it's still kind of the brain trust of the right. It was largely responsible for disseminating information about and propaganda about Whitewater and Bill Clinton's, Troopergate, and sort of propelling a lot of the narratives that instigated the impeachment proceedings against Clinton. I mean, Fallwell was very involved in that too.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, there's a pattern here in terms of, not just in terms of the relationship between evangelicals and Mormons politically and in the hard right in American politics, but the anti-communism, the demonization of the Democrat in power, because you see that happening now with Obama.
Sure.
So sort of an interesting... I mean, do you see that, that it's kind of a pattern that they've established?
Oh, absolutely. The parallel is perfect. It makes absolute sense that Beck should be on friendly terms and sort of a chosen Mormon of Fallwell Jr., because Skousen, Beck's main influence, was on such friendly terms with Fallwell Sr. So it's sort of like the mini-cons getting together, the children of the famous neocons in a sense, although we'll see what becomes of their work together, whether it's anything like on the same level as the last generation.
So Beck has done a lot to popularize Skousen, and you see that today. Skousen's book is read by Tea Party Beck's followers and Tea Party people, and sort of some of these disparate groups that kind of come together to form the Tea Party. So Skousen's seeing a little bit of a comeback because, in part, of Beck.
Absolutely. I mean, I spent most of the last year sort of visiting Tea Parties and Tea Party-associated groups around the country, and the one sort of consistent thread that you see is one of the most consistent threads is interest in Skousen's work, and particularly the 5,000-year leap. Often this book will be sold at the meetings. It'll be piled up in the back of the room. Speakers on the sort of far-right circuit, they'll teach out of Skousen's books. They'll be photocopying chapters and handing it out. It is one of the major manuals that is being read on this new scene.
And let's just sort of summarize the premise of the 5,000-year leap. The idea is that the Constitution was divinely inspired, and the divine inspiration that's supposed to be guiding America is now hanging by a thread thanks to the New World Order, this sort of conspiratorial, humanistic, secular, possibly communist thing that they see as a threat to their view of what America is as a Christian nation. I mean, is that...
That's basically it. Although the term New World Order doesn't actually appear in the document, but it is implicit. Yeah.
Okay. So I want to come back to that, but before I do, I want to still stay on the liberty thing briefly, because something that's been curious to me is why Beck's sort of racially tinged tropes that he engages in on his television program, why that hasn't affected his relationship with the religious right. Now, so we've kind of worked through this Mormon evangelical rift, or supposed Mormon evangelical rift. But one other thing that the religious right is doing now is trying to reach out to Latinos and African Americans to try to broaden its base. And I just reported on a conference that was held at Liberty just a few days before they announced that Beck was going to be their commencement speaker, where the explicit purpose of it was to bring more African American and Latinos into the religious right. They're calling it the Freedom Federation now because they're trying to rebrand a little bit. But, in your book, you talk a great deal of some of these sort of very, racially provocative invectives that he engages in. Back in his radio career, making fun of Asian Americans, his whole discussion of Obama having a deep-seated hatred of the white culture, the whole Van Jones, Acorn, all of this, and sort of suggesting with regard to Acorn, when did we lose our country? It's been taken over by thieves and criminals and Marxists. Mm-hmm. So do you have any sense of, how it is that conservatives perceive these? Do they perceive these statements that he makes and these campaigns that he engages in differently than his critics on the left who see all this as being racist?
Yeah, I read your piece. I thought it was a good one. There's a line that I thought of reading it. It's something people used to say about Turkey. The country of Turkey was a man running west on a boat going east. I think that's something like the predicament that the religious right is in terms of trying to create bridges to 21st century America. I mean, Beck is a perfect embodiment of that problem. I mean, they realize, the leaders of the party, major figures of conservatism, can see the writing on the wall. They see the demographic trends. It's clear where things are headed. And at the same time, they've got a base that can't get enough of nonstop Acorn bashing, out of context, Van Jones, audio snippets. Reverend Wright is,
Sure.
Black nationalist devil in your daughter's bedroom kind of red meat. And as long as the stars of the movement are shoveling that stuff up and being wildly popular doing it and not being called out for it, I really don't see how these sort of elite social movement building outreach efforts like the ones you're writing about are really going to do much. And, I know that there was a piece in the Times today about 32 black Republican candidates on the slate during the midterms, but I mean, I don't see that really reflecting a groundswell of new open-mindedness on the part of blacks and Latinos in this country to the Republican conservative message, because that message is just so streaked with white anger and resentment at this, the undeserving, implicitly racialized poor message that the right has been, feeding for so long. That's still there. It's still very strong.
Well, one interesting thing, I mean, I think that has been portrayed as, the Republican Southern strategy, stoking that white resentment, that fear that there are, black people who are going to take your job or change your way of life. And, Beck definitely plays into that. Do you think that with the Mormon connection with Beck and Skousen and the building of the religious right that dates back to Fallwell's relationship with Skousen, do you think that there's an effort to make on their part, a deliberate effort on their part to make it not just a Southern strategy, that maybe it's their Western or Southwestern strategy?
That was definitely part of the thinking of Fallwell originally reaching out to Skousen and the Mormons, they wanted to sort of extend their reach as a movement into the West, as opposed to just being Southern-based and limited to that. It's worked. I mean, they've had successes at the state level, Nevada and California, and certainly, look at Utah, and even other states that have significant Mormon populations, Florida. They've been able to mobilize Mormon foot soldiers. And success, yeah, sure, but ultimately I think they're both sort of running against the larger direction of history, and even together at their full power, I don't see them representing the future. Mormon numbers are actually dwindling. They're not retaining people after baptism the way they used to. And in fact, they stopped.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
They used to baptize and then monitor, and they would keep those numbers. Now they're just keeping the baptismal numbers, because if they kept up with people, they'd actually be dwindling.
So,
much more than they already are.
But I wonder if what they're trying to build here is not so much based on the Mormonism or based on evangelicalism, but it's more of a political alliance than a religious alliance.
Clearly, yeah. I mean, religiously, they're still at odds. I mean, as bizarre as the differences between them may seem from a sort of secular rationalist perspective, they're real for the people within that fight. And one of the reasons they like to ally with each other is because deep down they still want to convert the other one. In the 90s, the Southern Baptist Convention actually held their national conference in Salt Lake City with the stated intention of converting Mormons. So even while they agree on all these social issues, deep down they still find the other one wrong and in need of a good conversion. That Southern Baptist Convention conference was probably a low point in evangelical Mormon relations. Things are a bit better now.
Now, the Mormons place a high premium on being a missionary and going out and doing missionary work as when you're a young adult. And of course, evangelicals also believe in doing missionary work and going out and performing the Great Commission. Do you think that Beck sees himself as that? Because you hear a lot of religious right figures talking about the media and Hollywood being, they call it a mission field. I mean, do you think Beck sees himself in that light, that he sees himself as a missionary whose mission is to work through television?
I think, I can see that. I think he sees himself more as a movement leader, more of a Moses than just a 19-year-old missionary foot soldier in some village. Mormon missionary. I mean, this thing he has planned for August is quite breathtaking in scope. It's going to be.
Let's talk about that a little.
He's going to be speaking at the foot of the Lincoln Memorial on the anniversary of Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, and he's the headliner. And he really does appear to think God is speaking through him, and he has a major role to play in saving the Republic. And in the Mormon view, the Constitution will be hanging from a thread, and the Mormons will come to power, possibly in the form of Mitt Romney, and save the Republic. So I think there's something going on there. Something quite a bit more than just seeing himself as a missionary.
So more of a self-aggrandizement than just a missionary.
Mm-hmm.
So did he purposely pick the date of King's "I Have a Dream" speech?
Yeah, he did. And at first he was talking about the significance of that date, and at some point somebody must have told him that Martin Luther King was a famous progressive who, among other things, opposed the Vietnam War and supported universal health care, and he stopped talking about that pretty quick. Now he claims that the day was chosen just because it's near Labor Day and he wanted people to be able to bring their children. But if you go back and look at the tape from the day he announced the march, he was talking about Martin Luther King. In fact, for an entire year on Fox, he had Martin Luther King's image at the start of his show. It was Adams, Jefferson, and King, which is pretty ironic considering Jefferson.
Even as he was bashing Acorn and Van Jones and having his watermelon theory about Van Jones.
Oh yeah, I mean the ignorance of Glenn Beck is just can never cease to amaze.
So can you describe that? You describe it in your book. He had this, I think he called it the watermelon theory, and this related to Van Jones, who was President Obama's green jobs advisor, what Beck liked to call the green jobs czar.
Right.
What was this watermelon theory that he
Right. Well, let's not be too generous, first of all. Beck didn't come up with it. Like many of the scripts on his shows, it was fed to him by the group Americans for Prosperity, which is funded by the Koch Industries Foundation, and in particular, it was their national policy director, this guy named Phil Kirpin, who was tight with Beck's producers, and he sent him some background info on Van Jones. And
energy industry insiders didn't like the idea of having someone who was advising the president on green jobs.
Well, the other thing would discredit the whole environmental agenda, of which green jobs is central.
And Beck also ran with that, but also these sort of racially tinged attacks on Jones.
Phil Kirkman, was sort of like Mikey's older brother in the old Life commercials. Like, look at this, try this. Sure enough, Beck did it, ran with it for 3 months, found it was great television, great radio. Here he had this scary, black, angry, street-style kind of activist, which is, he knows his audience quite well. He knows that this is, what they deep down fear more than anything. And the idea that this would be so close to the Oval Office, he just ran with it. And he spent, the better part of last summer just playing audio clips that a lot of times were not nearly as, pretty much every case were not nearly as significant as he led people to believe. Really, he had anything like the power that he told people that he had, Dan Jones.
Right, because it was actually somebody else discovered that Jones had allegedly signed some petition of questioning whether 9/11 was an inside job, and that was ultimately what led Jones to resign, not anything Beck did.
Right. But to answer your question about the watermelon offices, basically the idea was to present to Beck's audience the idea that green jobs was like a watermelon. You have a thin green veneer, which is being sold to the public by the president. You cut it open, and it's deep red, and there's little tiny seeds of black nationalism spread throughout. And that was the image that he very successfully conveyed to his audience every day.
So there was no accident? Was this an accident with the sort of the racial connotations of using a watermelon as his analogy?
It does appear that Kirpin came up with the idea before he found the Van Jones background info.
Okay.
Not 100%, but the timeline does appear to let him off at least that one hook. But certainly, once the Van Jones stuff came to light and Beck ran with it, you have to wonder if they got an extra little smirk out of it because of that.
Or you'd have to wonder why they might not think, well, perhaps this is not the greatest analogy,
right?
Given that the person we're talking about is African American. That's a really interesting component of his this racial stuff, these racial tropes that he uses to try to prove his points. Let's move on though to his more that's one aspect of his style when he goes on the attack against his perceived political enemies. But let's look at another element of his style, which is his sentimentality, the tears, the confessionals, the very prototypically Mormon bearing testimony.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this, you've written about this, and Joanna Brooks has written about it for us at RD, and other people have written about it, that this is a quintessentially Mormon way of men, in particular, bearing testimony about their personal beliefs, but also their concern for the country as a whole and what's happening to the country and the whole Constitution hanging by a thread narrative. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Right. One of the interesting things about Beck's style and the very emotional appeals to country is when you talk to Mormons, and especially Mormon scholars, they'll tell you that it reminds them exactly of what you see at the Ward House on the weekends when people get up and perform a ritual known as bearing testimony. And this is the closest thing any religion probably has to an institutionalized radio monologue in the culture of that religion. Basically, people get up and speak for 2 or 3 minutes about something that they feel very strongly, and they don't have to know it through logic or reason. It can be something they just know in their gut. And often at the crescendo moment of this performance, there'll be a choke in the throat, there'll be eyes missing over, and possibly a tear spilling down the cheek. And this is it's a ritual. I mean, it's a social ritual, very male, and it's a sign of authority within the Mormon Church. The higher you go up the ladder, the more tears you see, and the more powerful the performance is for the Mormon layman. And,
so that's if you're good at it, you rise in the Mormon Church, is what you're saying.
Well, I don't know if you get promoted because of it, but if you go on the LDS website and you watch the leadership gatherings, you notice that the higher up you go, the more you see it, and the longer the choked pause is, the more misty eyes, and it's clear that it's something that's reserved for the brass to really pull out.
And is the purpose a self-confession? I was fallen and now I've redeemed myself? Or is it more political, more about the Skousen concern? Or actually it was Ezra Taft Benson, who was a forerunner of Skousens, right? Who talked about the Constitution hanging by a thread?
They were colleagues in the church at the same time. Taft became president of the church after Skousen had sort of retired from public life.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about Benson and about this Constitution hanging by a thread and how that plays together with Beck's professed concern for the Republic and how he incorporates that into his very Mormon bearing testimony with the tears and the getting choked up and so forth.
Right. Well, Taft was Skousen's main ally at the time, when a lot of the Mormons were terrified at the attention Skousen was getting as being a raving nutcase. Benson kind of protected him, and he was an apostle and created the space and won over other church leaders to their view that the standard of being a good Mormon was adhering to John Birch Society politics. And
John Birch Society was the virulently anti-communist propaganda group, which is now we're seeing more of. We saw them at the Conservative Political Action Conference, but they were purged from the conservative movement by William F. Buckley, who thought that they were sort of conspiracy-minded, New World Order ideology was not right for the conservative movement.
Right. So we're not talking about mainstream conservatives here. And Taft actually was picked by Eisenhower to be Secretary of Agriculture for 2 terms, sort of an acknowledgement.
Didn't the founder of the John Birch Society think that Eisenhower was a communist agent?
Yes, that was The Politician by Robert Welch, was a book that famously had that as its main thesis.
So did Benson have any concern about working for the Eisenhower administration?
He kept his mouth shut while he was serving, but when he got out, he aligned with the Birch view that Eisenhower was not to be trusted and had suspect allegiances. And in fact, a couple people were golfing with Eisenhower at some point, and someone asked him if he still kept in touch with Benson, and Eisenhower just sort of rolled his eyes and made a gesture like, I have no idea what happened to that guy. He's completely lost his mind. But when Benson was serving as Secretary of Agriculture, he viewed his appointment in millennialist terms. He thought that it was a sign of Mormons' arrival in America, and that it forebode even more Mormon involvement in politics in the future. And he thought the crisis would occur further down the line, there'd be more Mormons in power, and the Mormons would, save the day and end up basically ruling the country from, Washington, D.C. and Salt Lake City.
So he had sort of a dominionist kind of theology, much like the religious right has.
Yeah, and this is the period at which the two started to track closer and closer together. And now you've got Mormons who really are indistinguishable from, some of the other evangelical groups. They read the Tim LaHaye books. They believe in salvation. A lot of the doctrinal differences are disappearing, and the reforms of Joseph Smith towards the end of his life, a lot of his writings are being forgotten and called merely speculations now, and things, basically the history of the church is being rewritten, and this new sort of neo-orthodoxy, it's called, is basically evangelism with some weird stuff about Jesus in North America. That's basically what it's come down to.
So you're saying that the LDS Church is backing away from some of the long-standing commitment to some of the prophecies of Joseph Smith?
Some not others, but yeah, Smith's purview in theology of the church has definitely been shrinking.
So was it Benson or was it Skousen who talked about the Constitution hanging by a thread?
And that's a prophetic folklore that goes back to the 19th century. They all sort of had talked about it. In fact, Warren Hatch even dropped that phrase 2 years ago on Beck's show, and they both sort of did this, very quiet sort of dog whistle.
Nod, wink, wink.
Yeah, and, the Mormon listeners knew exactly what they were talking about, and they actually repeated the phrase something like 3 or 4 times. So, it's not something that's, lost to history. It's still very much in the forefront of politically active. And these,
so what was the impetus for them saying, for these prophecies back in the 19th century that the Constitution was hanging by a thread? What were the perceived threats then?
It was a vision. It was sort of a deathbed vision that Joseph Smith had, I believe.
And was that based on any political, anything political going on in the United States then? Did he feel threatened by any political movement or the ascendancy of any political figures, much like Beck feels threatened?
I'm not aware of any
today.
connection. I don't want to pose as an expert on 19th century Mormonism. But clearly they felt beleaguered at the time, and they were. They were a very persecuted minority, the Mormons.
So how much do you get the sense that this Constitution hanging by a thread prophecy that comes out of his Mormonism drives Beck in these sort of choked up, fake tears, what does he use, vapor rub to make himself cry, discussions of how, America is not, we're losing the real America?
Mm-hmm. Well, it certainly works even short of its Mormon, meaning. The idea that Obama, which was the trigger for that conversation with Hatch, represents some sort of end of the Republic in this horrifying new radical rot in the seat of power. I don't think Beck is stupid enough to actually come out and draw that connection with 19th century Mormon folklore, but it works pretty well just in the secular usage. So he's happy to apply the same.
Because in the evangelical world, just to draw that comparison again, a lot of the end times theology drove a lot of the anti-communism. And actually, I think you talked in the book about, I can't remember if it was Skousen or Benson, but that they used to tour with the Christian anti-communism crusade, which was Fred Schwartz's group, which has been taken over by an organization in Colorado now, and they still publish his anti-communism newsletter. And they were very much sort of a product of that John Birch Society era, where they tied the this new world order of socialism and communism as being antithetical to what they call a biblical worldview. Yeah, and that gets played in different ways in different parts of the evangelical world. But you probably have too. At the 9/12 rally, met people who thought Obama was the Antichrist, and that must mean that the Antichrist is coming, and that there's this consolidation of the New World Order, which involves socialism and communism, and that presages the whole end time scenario in the Book of Revelation. But what you're describing with the Mormon prophecy is, I guess, a little bit different, or is it?
Well, it dovetails, which is really all that matters for the purposes of building an audience like Beck has, which is not just Mormons, although he's huge in Utah. There's billboards that line the roads into the cities and towns of Utah with Beck's face on it, but also tens of millions of evangelicals and even Catholics and the whole sort of spectrum of religious conservatives. And I don't know how many of those non-Mormon listeners know too much about Beck's the way that Beck's politics have sort of been shaped in the crucible of Mormon characters like Skousen and Benson. But I imagine they're willing to give him a pass as long as what he's saying lines up with what Rush Limbaugh is saying, more or less.
But Skousen, going back to some of the racial stuff, Skousen has had his issues with race. Did he not write in one of his books? Backtracking to what we talked about earlier. where didn't he write a book or something, an article where he talked about?
Oh, Skousen was a fierce foe of, as was the entire church leadership for the most part, of civil rights. They viewed the civil rights attack on the Mormon Church and its official racist policies as being directed by Moscow. And this was pretty. There was a scare actually in 1966, I think it was 65 or 66, where the Utah Birch Society claimed that civil rights activists were going to march on Utah from Watts and start riots, and the National Guard had to be called out. People were terrified to leave their homes. Taft was delivering these, as an apostle of the church, was delivering lectures about, the communist and satanic influences on the civil rights movement. He actually, one of the speeches, this is an interesting note, was used as the foreword to a book of what can only be described as race hate. Actually featured on its cover a severed head of an African American. It was called, White Alternatives and the Red Menace.
So this was Benson or Skousen?
Yeah. It was a Mormon author book that used one of Benson's speeches as its foreword. And I mean, it was a small press, but it was out there, and it was known that he wasn't stripped of his role even after the book came out. So yeah, these guys were fiercely against civil rights, and of course, as goes without saying, any sign of black militant politics. One interesting note on that subject: towards the end of his life, Skousen actually formed a friendship with Eldridge Cleaver, of all people,
right.
The former Minister of Information for the Black Panther Party, who fell in with the Moonies, and then briefly flirted and played footsie with the Mormon Church, and actually
Did he convert to Mormonism? Did Cleaver convert?
Very briefly, yeah, and then he sort of drifted back to his search. But he gave lectures under the banner of the Freeman Society and hung out and had dinners with Gary Fallwell.
And the Freeman Society was the one that Skousen ran.
Yeah, that was his religious right organization in Washington.
But didn't Skousen also wrote some tract where he talked about, he compared black children to pickaninnies and said that, the slave owners...
Oh, yeah. I mean, all his lectures on the Constitution involved, what can really be called basically Klan interpretations of slavery and race relations in this country. And he got in quite a bit of trouble for it in the 1980s when some bicentennial commissions were using it as a fundraising tool, his books, specifically The Miracle of America, and people finally cracked one of these books and said, my God.
This was in California, right?
Yeah, that was the most high-profile case, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, how much do you think that Beck, he has this sort of ahistorical, divorced from reality, sentimental take? And when I say sentimental, I don't mean sentimental in a nice way, this sort of ahistorical sentimentalization of what America is, and that, it's being threatened by the current president and by liberals and by socialists and Stalinists and whoever else. I mean, to what extent do you think he had a built-in audience for this? And that he's really, he's not original, he's derivative of all these forerunners that he had, including Skousen and Benson, but also including his evangelical and John Birch Society type forerunners. So how much do you think his popularity is explained by a potentially built-in audience like this versus his unique capabilities to draw the audience in through his shenanigans?
Well, I mean, that's the word. I mean, shenanigans, that's really what he brings to the table that's new and distinct, is his delivery, but none of his ideas are really that remarkable to the extent that you can call them ideas. What's new is their incoherence and the way he sort of, uses this grab bag approach to, race baiting, red baiting, all of these sort of old, cans that he taps into. And I think because people are so, their attention spans are so fractured and they know less than ever about history, that he's able to do it and be so incoherent about it. I mean, if you compare what he does to even what, Skousen did or some of these other forerunners that he represents the same tradition, they at least were, much more on message and developed elaborate, consistent theories, whereas with Beck, he'll drop a New World Order reference. Other times it sounds like, to McCarthy, and like, he's not really sure who's running the show. If the New World Order types that he's influenced by, it was the words of high finance in New York and London. With Beck, you get the sense that he thinks it's really just socialists and radicals, and then he'll just zoom around, and no one's really trying to keep him, taken to task for making sense or being consistent. And that I think is reflected as much of the time as it is of him. He is the Adderall, kind of populist. Not populist, sorry, but, faux populist right-wing demagogue.
It's interesting. When I watch him, he reminds me a little bit of a televangelist in the sense that, if you watch somebody like, Rod Parsley or Kenneth Copeland, they can do some of the same things in terms of, bringing in this hodgepodge of, New World Order, communists, bad people, America's a Christian nation, the Constitution was divinely inspired, which is kind of something that they, Beck seems to derive that from his Mormonism and his Mormon roots. But, obviously David Barton and wall builders and many on the religious right have, promoted that same idea that, the founders were inspired by God and the Constitution is a godly document. But he kind of reminds me of them in that way, that he puts that hodgepodge of things together, and the crying is sort of reminiscent of Jimmy Swaggart, but that was much more of a personal, like he had fallen and he was asking forgiveness from his followers, after that prostitution scandal that Swaggart had. With Beck, it's almost like he is so self-aggrandized as compared to some of the televangelists who talk about their personal failings as a way of promoting salvation. It's almost that he's so self-aggrandized that he almost doesn't, his sentimentality isn't about that. His sentimentality is about that he's almost this apostle for what America should be, and he's the one who's serving as this warning sign for everyone. Warning them of what's going to befall America if they don't listen to him.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see it? I mean, and how do you've been at events where you've talked to people who are big fans of his. How do you think he sees himself, and how do they see him?
They see him as a very brave, very lonely truth teller who's willing to put his life on the line, and of course he's never far from talking about how his life is at risk and how brave he is, and how people are always complimenting him on his bravery. The delivery clearly borrows a lot from the televangelists, mixed with some Tony Robbins motivational speaking influence, and a possibly, I can't claim to know, a possibly psychotic belief that God is actually speaking through him, and that he is some sort of historical figure on the level of
Joseph Smith?
Sam Adams or something.
Or
but,
Joseph Smith, perhaps.
Yes.
Yeah, does he have his own version of the golden tablet that... I mean, in a way, it's almost like Beck wants to start a new religion in which Beck is the head of it.
It clearly looks that way. I mean, the cult of Beck just keeps growing just when you think it can't grow anymore. He'll do something like start this Insider Extreme program on his website that allows you to watch him from 5 different angles as he performs his radio show. Where does it go from here? I don't know, but it's kind of, interesting to watch in a sick way. And the thing in Washington in August, I'll be very interested to see what sort of language he brings to that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, do you sense that his followers have a sort of religious devotion to him?
The first thing I would love when we talk to him is always, aside from his bravery, is how entertaining he is. I guess it's all relative. If that's your life is, watching Fox News, I guess Glenn Beck is entertaining. In the context of AM radio, I guess his show is better than being screamed at by Mark Levin. these people aren't going to Chris Rock shows, so I guess, in their world, he is entertaining. But that is very high on the list of things that people say about him. And he genuinely makes them laugh.
So it's interesting. He may be making more of the religious aspects of his performance than his audience does.
I think that's very possible.
Uh-huh. Well, listen, thanks so much for talking about the book, and good luck with it.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Okay, sir.